Blog Talk Radio.
Hello from my heart, everybody. Welcome to another great edition of Transitions to Transformation Radio. Tonight we have a very special edition. It's Veterans Voices for Veterans for Peace. I belong to Chapter 119 in St. Petersburg, and tonight is it's a great privilege to be sitting with President McKeating and also Reverend Bruce, who is also a member. He's a chairman for the Outreach Committee. There's many homeless veterans that he helps get back on their feet, and we're going to be talking a lot about the state of current affairs, what's going on in the world, and what our mission is at Veterans for Peace. And we do have a disclaimer: none of our opinions reflect Veterans for Peace. These are our personal opinions. So tonight I'm going to allow Don McKeating to interview Reverend Bruce. I will be heading off on the soundboard. Anybody that wishes to call, please call us at area code 646-652-4889. And I'm going to turn it over to Veterans for Peace President Don McKeating.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, for the opportunity, and thank you on behalf of Veterans for Peace. I'm really pleased to be here with you, and you're also a member.
Yes.
And with Reverend Wright, who's very well known in the St. Petersburg and Tampa Bay area for his activism, especially with the homeless people. And we're very happy to have him with Veterans for Peace. Our organization goes back to around 1985, and we are the only organization that really opposes war as an instrument of state policy. I would like to take a moment to read our mission statement so people really know what we stand for. It begins, "We, having dutifully served our nation, do hereby affirm our greater responsibility to serve the cause of world peace. To this end, we will work with others to increase public awareness of the costs of war, to restrain our government from intervening overtly or covertly in the internal affairs of other nations, to end the arms race and reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, to seek justice for veterans and the victims of war, and to abolish war as an instrument of state policy. To achieve these goals, members of Veterans for Peace pledge to use nonviolent means and to maintain an organization that is both democratic and open, with the understanding that all members are trusted to act in the best interest of the group for the larger purpose of world peace." So this is what we're all about, and we're hoping that people will realize that you don't have to join the American Legion or the VFW or any of the other organizations. If you're interested in being a veteran and you are not, if you understand that war is really not the answer, you're welcome with us. So Bruce, tell us, how long have you been in the Tampa Bay area?
Well, actually, since the mid to late 70s. My father and family moved down here during the economic crisis, oil crisis in the early 70s, and a lot of the other economic situations going on in the world at the time. So we moved down here, and I have been here since. I grew up in Boston, outside of Boston.
Okay. So you've been an activist here for quite some time. You're an ordained minister, and what was your first type of activism here in the Tampa Bay area?
Well, it's kind of funny. We were talking about this before the show. I actually have made a long journey from activism on the right. At one time, I went to Falwell School and was a member of the Young Republicans and the Moral Majority, even campaigned for Pat Robertson back in the 80s, and took the long journey over to the other end. I wonder sometimes if it was out of rebellion that I did that, ironically, back in the 80s, because my parents have a long history of activism on the left. My grandfather was with the IWW, and he campaigned for Eugene Debs. He's a military veteran. He fought in the Spanish-American War, which, if you think about it, I'm the youngest in my family, and my grandfather, if he were alive, would have been 140 today in this time. And then my dad was a veteran of World War II in the Pacific Theater, and saw action in the Pacific Theater. And then and both of my brothers were in the military during the Vietnam era, one of whom was in the Army and unfortunately has some PTSD, which is certainly a whole subject to talk about. PTSD. PTSD. I always get those confused there. And then my other brother was in the Air Force, originally stationed in missile bases on the Turkish-Russian border. So very interesting history militarily with my family. I'm the first to not serve in the military. However, I believe that the last thing our country needs to do is to be mistreating veterans like we have been in this country. And that's always been a big thing for me, because 1/3 of all the homeless in this country are veterans. A lot of people don't realize that, how huge the number is. It's one of the biggest shames that our country has, is how we've treated veterans. So that's what, I'm probably jumping ahead of you here, but that's what attracted me to Veterans for Peace. Not only because of my own family and their history, but just in general how veterans are treated. I know my father and my brother both went through a hard time with some of the veterans' benefits that they deserved and were a long time in coming.
Yes, it sounds to me that you've made a good case for evolution, coming from the right to the left like you have. Also, I have to comment that we have almost opposite backgrounds. My father was a McCarthyite, and I was raised in a very right-wing environment, and I think maybe my rebellion against that right-wing philosophy has got me started, especially when I got away from his influence. And my experience in the Army, I learned very quickly that military discipline does not build character. I can remember being in an inspection and being told that I have a thread loose in my uniform, and looking down and not seeing anything, and being made to do push-ups until I collapsed, and having to continue until I agreed there was a thread loose on my uniform. All it made out of me was a liar. And I don't really think that, I think that's only anecdotal, but I think that seems to be the philosophy of the military, is following orders and not thinking for yourself. And I really can't see that as building character. PTSD is something that we finally admit exists. It used to be called shell shock, as you know. And before then, it was probably just called plain cowardice, unfortunately. I get my medical care at the VA, and you can see from most of the people there that most of the veterans are not very well fixed. And I have to admit, in my case, if it wasn't for the VA, I would probably be broke right now. I have received very good medical care, but they are overwhelmed. And with the type of injuries they're going to be getting from these wars, which in other wars would have been fatal, this system is being overwhelmed. They're doing the best they can, but there's a real problem with the average veteran going along with war as a matter of pride, and taking pride in the fact that they were in the military and being co-opted by the Republican Party in the right wing, where they feel that they can just give veterans a parade or some kind of notoriety and they get their votes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. One of the interesting statistics that's coming out from groups like the National Coalition for the Homeless and of course various veterans groups is that as we see the winding down, allegedly, of at least the Iraq War and supposedly the Afghanistan War, although it remains to be seen how long we'll stay there and what other wars we're in the middle of looking at getting into, because we're all over the world involved in military incursions that I think most Americans don't know about. But one of the interesting statistics coming out is the number of expected homeless people that will be homeless that are Iraq and Afghani war veterans. One recent statistic they discussed was that in Florida alone, they are expecting 12,000 Iraqi and Afghani war veterans that may be homeless. And one of the reasons, of course, they're going to be drawn to our area is we have the VA regional hospital. And just that one little statistic alone, 12,000 may not sound like a lot in the grand scheme of the whole country, but when you consider that they're talking as many as 12,000 homeless in Florida, that may be drawn here because of their homeless state that are former Iraqi and Afghan war veterans is pretty startling. So,
yes, there's another aspect to that. We're all familiar. Yes, we have a caller.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, gentlemen. We do have a caller who's been patiently waiting for 6 minutes. The last 4 digits are 0373. So we're going to put you on live now. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, good evening, caller. Could you state your name and where you're calling from?
Yes, this is Nancy McKeating calling from St. Pete. And I just wondered if you could touch on the topic that you feel is most important. I'll just listen.
Okay, that's a challenging question, Nancy. And there are so many. The plight of veterans, the fact that we're producing many more veterans with these wars that we may be getting into at any time, Syria, Iran, and in previous conversations, Reverend Wright and I did talk briefly about Africa Corps. Not Africa Corps, Africa Com, but it should be called Africa Corps because it would be about the same mentality. Our troops in Africa competing with what the Chinese are doing, which are building infrastructure, and we're going there for military purposes. Could you expound on that a little bit, Reverend?
Well, yeah, it almost is akin to the Reagan policy of the 80s and what we did in Central America. Obama's policies rival that in Africa, ironically. And what AFRICOM is essentially a central command that's being created in Africa for military bases, military incursions, advisory missions. We're in 34 countries in Africa. Now, if you think about that, there's, I think, maybe 40 countries currently in Africa. So we're in the majority of countries in Africa in some form, whether it's a drone base, military advisors, different kinds of special ops and other kinds of training troops or things of that nature. And I always loved the word military advisor. I think, as a kid, I was somewhat young when Vietnam happened, but I remember hearing that word used often, that we had military advisors in Vietnam, and we all know what that meant and what it became. So, yeah, that is probably one of the, I think, gravest concerns. We have more military bases around the world than any empire, and I use that word for the United States, in the history of mankind. The Roman Empire never had as many military bases at their height. The British Empire, Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, you could name almost any kind of large imperial kind of power, and none of them rival the number of bases we have around the world. And yet, when these men and women serve our country, or bravely stand up and speak the truth like Bradley Manning has, we treat them as such a low priority in our country when they come back. And it's a tragic thing because many of these men and women are coming back with some severe mental trauma. And sometimes we don't even give them the time to heal mentally before they get involved in things in this country that are rather frightening, such as, and I know you have a law enforcement background, and you know that a lot of law enforcement people are military vets, and I get concerned sometimes that there's not enough transition. It's like you're coming from the battleground to being a street police officer, and it's a totally different environment, but sometimes because there's a little bit of similarities in appearance, police officers end up reacting in ways that we wouldn't want them to. So it's almost difficult to really prioritize because it's so overwhelming.
Does that answer your question, Nancy, or do you have another?
Well, that was very informative, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to...
I was wondering, too, if the host could tell the listeners if there is a radio number on the dial people can listen to, or on the computer on listening to the show on talk radio, what specific network they should be searching for in the computer?
If you could just go on to blogtalkradio.com and just look up Transitions to Transformation Radio. And
I did that, and I'll try it again. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling.
You're
I would
welcome.
like to touch on the police aspect. I didn't introduce myself with my background. I am a Vietnam veteran. I'm 20% disabled. I have a hearing loss, and my nose is all broken up. And I did feel like I was a soldier on leave when I was actually discharged, having served honorably in the Army in a fire direction unit in Vietnam. And I tried to go to college. I had been discharged in June, and I went to college in September, and I was not ready. I was partying all the time, didn't do my homework, was just feeling that freedom that I hadn't had for a long time, and became interested in law enforcement, having worked as a hospital security guard, working my way through college, and being in the emergency room when the police were there for various cases. And quite frankly, I'm not overly proud about being a veteran. This may alienate some fellow veterans because many of us take too much pride in the fact we were veterans. It seems that, especially when we get older, we look back on that time when we were young, where we were virile. It was probably the biggest adventure in most of our lives. And we cling to that. I see that when I go to the VA hospital because I may be the only person there at times that's not in costume, with wearing all my medals, my hats that say everything about me, and just being veteran from head to foot. I think that's a sign, in some cases, of some easily manipulated pride. I think it's unfortunate. On the other hand, as a police officer, the mission is entirely different. And I never did confuse the two, and some do. Quite frankly, since the Reagan period, the police departments probably across the country have been following a military model. You can see that with the assault weapons small town departments have, assault vehicles. They're gearing up for something. Also concurrent with that was the drug war, which is something that I think has been absolutely detrimental to law enforcement, where you have to have the trust of your community. And if you have people in your community that the only thing they do is wrong is smoke some marijuana occasionally, and sometimes for medical reasons, that breaks the trust. And that cannot be. I went into law enforcement right after the Chicago Convention. And at the time, I think it was a very good window of opportunity for myself and some like-minded people, because they were looking for people that had more of a social worker's mentality in law enforcement, and they did not want the military model. Now, those of us old enough to remember the convention in Chicago, if you put the dots together on that, the police officers were largely Korean War veterans raised in the 1950s, of age in the 1950s, but their views were probably formed in the 1940s. And this was a period of youth rebellion. The baby boomer generation, which I was college age at the time. And there was a real cultural clash between the values of the 1950s and the age of Aquarius, you might say. The mission of police, even then and now, is not the same as the military. You never go in and accept collateral damage. You try to keep the peace. You try to, if necessary, is the only time you would use any force. And there's what they call a continuum of force, where it's always the lowest possible you can use in order to bring somebody peacefully to trial. The object is to let them have their day in court and to keep peace, which I think is a very noble profession. And it's become more of a profession now. On the downside, they're looking for a military mentality, but on the upside, the officers are much more educated than they were in my time. So I look back on it, and quite frankly, I was an activist since the first Gulf War. I was a late bloomer. I was sent to Germany as a rocket launcher crewman and volunteered for Vietnam, thinking it was the right thing to do. Because I thought, well, there's two Vietnams, there's one that's capitalist, and I didn't use the word capitalist back then with my meager education. I used the word freedom like they do today. It should have been always, never freedom versus communism, it should always been called capitalism versus communism, because they're economic systems that were at war in reality. So I volunteered there because I had a sense of adventure and because I wanted to be a real soldier and not parading around all day putting up with inspections. So as a veteran, I was asked to join Veterans for Peace. I was asked to join the American Legion by my father when I got back from Vietnam, and I was not allowed into that organization because they said it wasn't a war. And it was called a police action. We call it a war in retrospect. And also because the members didn't want anybody there that from our generation that was just interested in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So I didn't join. Many years later, having retired from police work, I was invited to, I was told about Veterans for Peace, and I decided I'd form a chapter up in Madison, Wisconsin, where I retired, and was really happy to be in that very progressive college community. And I've been down here now for about 5 years, and I find my community of Gulfport and St. Petersburg to be have progressive communities as well. So I'm sorry about the long-winded answer. I'll let Bruce get in here and say something.
Well, the thing that's important, and I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, a lot of people don't know this about me and may be shocked to find this out, that I actually was a criminal justice major in my early college years after going to theology for a while. I switched to criminal justice. I don't know how the connection was made. And went through the screening to be a police officer. One of my professors at college actually was personal friends with someone who I know a lot of former policemen like yourself consider a hero because he was, Serpico.
Absolutely.
And this professor was with in the same unit that Serpico was, and saw all that Serpico went through to be a truth teller. You know, speaking of Bradley Manning and whistleblowers and he's a whistleblower and still has people that don't think very highly of him. And so I'm not, it's ironic for some that I have that kind of sensibility there. And in fact, am considering a run for Pinellas County Sheriff in a few years myself for a lot of reasons. And that's a whole other entire show. But I think what's important in this is that too often, and this I noticed about just veterans that I've known through the years, too often we have not only not recognized the illnesses and struggles they had, because as you mentioned, they used to call it fatigue, which my father had, and he was a heavy drinker for some time. He had quit by the time I was born, but both of my older brothers had to experience that, and he was undiagnosed because battle fatigue was typical of what they would call it during World War II. And I guess the biggest concern for me is as people come back from wars, and the whole dynamic is changing too with the futuristic kind of wars that are being fought vis-a-vis drones, which again is another whole topic. But I don't know that we're still even adequately dealing with the trauma that people face, because war now is no longer the kind of war where two enemies meet on the battlefield and you have to see the person that you're going to shoot. As a theologian, part of what we looked at was the whole Augustine's just war theory. And that even the criteria for just war theory no longer exists in the wars we have, because they're not two people on the battlefield. And that was important because there was always this thought, wait, I'm killing another human being. He may be my enemy, at least on the battlefield, but I'm killing another human being. But with war as we fight it now, you can bomb from thousands of miles away. You can even fly an automated plane, we call them drones, and just bomb indiscriminately and not really have to think about the effects of that. And so I think we're dealing with there was a whole paradigm shift that happened with World War II, where it went, prior to that, there were always, some civilian casualties, but starting with World War II, the primary casualty in that war, from that point on, and all the wars since, were civilians. More civilians die in war than soldiers. And that has changed the whole dynamic of war itself, which is why I know Veterans for Peace exists, because there is this sense in which veterans recognize now it's not the war that we saw glamorized. I think you and I were talking before. I was talking with someone. When I was growing up, I remember watching the John Wayne and Audie Murphy films and kind of seeing this kind of idealized, glamorized view of war. And even that war, the so-called good war, we never really saw how devastating and how gruesome it was until, we started making movies where we showed the gruesomeness of World War II, probably most famously is Saving Private Ryan. I think that was the first time a mass audience ever saw World War II depicted the same way as we've seen the Vietnam War depicted, which have been depicted that way for years. And I think that there's this whole kind of lack of cognitive, in the psychological world we call it cognitive dissonance. And you know this from being in law enforcement, that there has to be this time where your mind kind of kicks in and says, this isn't right, or, this doesn't make sense, or I've got to think about this. The idea now is to make it so war is so automated and desensitized that the human cost is no longer factored in. That we have words like collateral damage, we have words like, what did Rumsfeld call them? When they were complaining about the beginnings of the Afghanistan war, there weren't enough targets of interest in that, because it wasn't Afghanistan wasn't a highly developed, industrialized kind of society like Iraq was. And of course, they appeared much more thrilled, the war machine under Bush, that Iraq had targets of interest, and this whole kind of mindset about war has changed, and we don't want people to see the human cost, and there's always going to be a human cost. There's never a time when war doesn't kill innocents anymore. Not that it maybe ever really existed at all, but at least there was a pretense to it. Now there isn't. And so you're kind of coming full circle and talking what we've been talking about, the whole effect that it has, and the caller earlier that asked questions about, what are the crucial issues? And the crucial issues to me now are this need to not allow the mechanization of war, the mechanization, to take away the human cost. And if we ever lose that sense as a society, then, it's what makes us human. I mean, my brother, God bless him, he had what's called, a Section 8. He just couldn't kill anybody. He couldn't bring himself to shoot. And, he got discharged from the Army with a Section 8. There was just a moral disconnect for him, in spite of all his mental limitations. And, if we lose that, then we lose our humanity. And that's the biggest concern I have. And, it's easier. I remember, you probably remember a cadence like this. I wasn't in the military, but I was in one of those fun paramilitary things when I was a kid, the Civil Air Patrol. You probably heard of it. And, I remember one of the cadences that I learned when we were doing our little marches, and so forth. And my brother, I heard him repeat it when he was at Fort Dix during basic training. The admirals and generals are at it again, fighting the war with a fountain pen sound off. you know, and really, you wonder sometimes if there was a video back in the 80s by this band called Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and it was about the video itself. This is when MTV actually showed videos. Was the Prime Minister or Premier of Russia and Reagan were in a boxing ring, fighting each other, and you know the whole story behind the video was, you know, if we actually got the leaders of our countries being in a position where they had to actually do the war and fight, you know, then they would have a totally different perspective. And you know this from being in the military, Don, that the generals don't fight the wars. The politicians don't fight the wars. And I guess we have a call.
Yes, we do. Last four digits are 8769. We're going to put you on right now. Thanks for waiting.
Yes, caller, would you state your name and where you're calling from, please?
Yeah, J. Alexander, St. Petersburg, Lellman, Florida. We're just as close to St. Petersburg. And thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for calling in. What's your question?
I got the question is, you know, what the Veterans for Peace state, you know, what's his purpose, and what's going on with the Bradley Manning trial. So I got some things to say, but I was wondering how you feel about the Bradley Manning trial.
Well, quite frankly, personally, I think Bradley Manning is a hero of the same quality as Daniel Ellsberg, even more so because Daniel Ellsberg at least had some very friendly press at the time, and public opinion seemed to be much more in his favor than it is now. We have Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Bradley Manning. These people, to me, are trying to show the public what's really going on behind the scenes, and instead of the facade that we have as a government. Bruce, would you have some comments on that too?
Well, yeah, I think the whole notion of whistleblowers has to be protected in our society, and what these people are that Don just mentioned, and in particular Bradley Manning, are heroes, are courageous people, and are truth tellers. And it's kind of ironic, just a few days ago was the birthday of George Orwell, for the anniversary. He's the one who famously said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary idea. And I was thinking about that in relation to this whole Bradley Manning thing, and just the courage of this young man, who, by the way, also came out, and came out as openly gay. So you've got to think to yourself, man, this man has put himself in a very, very tenuous, difficult, probably frightening position for him to say the truth like he's saying it, and not be ashamed of who he is as a person. So he's worthy of our support. I am relieved to hear that there are more, I guess you could say, celebrities and people of that nature coming out in support of him. But yeah, he's a hero, and we should treat him as such. We should treat him as someone who told the truth about what we did in Iraq. It was nothing but a slaughterhouse there. We traumatized forever the people of Iraq, especially their children, and we traumatized our troops, putting them in that kind of position. So, yeah, that's where I stand on it as well.
So, Jay, do you have some comments on this?
Yeah, I think that just taking to see when Bradley Manning was caught was during the Obama administration. He wasn't caught during. He was arrested in May of 2010, so he was 2 years shy of bringing this out during the Bush administration. There might have been better press coverage for him if he was doing this 2 years before. But apparently he was in Baghdad afterwards. So maybe that's another thing too, that the war is like putting, we have our bread and circuses, and the Iraq war is now officially quote unquote finished right now as of 2011, and he's just an afterthought. But now we have a another fellow that's up there, and but that's another story altogether. But Bradley Manning, I think, is getting an unfair. He's being treated unfairly. He was given a bare cement floor to sleep on, a cage to live in when he was in Iraq, and then now when he's over here too, he was treated very badly too. So the trial is going on, and I hope that he will be, the charges will be dropped. That's what I feel the same way, that he's being treated unfairly, and he's not a traitor. He's a whistleblower. He should be given commendation for doing that. So.
I was going to add too that another dynamic that's happening with the Bradley Manning trial is that, unlike the Zimmerman trial, where there's international press, open access to the press, there's been very little press that's been credentialed to be in any of the Bradley Manning hearings. And I think it's because, our government wants to, and the whole NSA thing has brought this out. The NSA, what Snowden has done with blowing the whistle on the NSA has brought this out, that our government wants to operate in secret. It wants to create scenarios and practice what it does in secret so that the public doesn't know. And so, to some extent, this Bradley Manning trial is a secretive trial. There's very little press access, and that's another tragedy.
I'd like to, I think Jay did touch on something interesting about the difference of the left and of the Democrats in particular, our reaction to this. We thought it was ludicrous when Bush, with his costume on the aircraft carrier, declared mission accomplished, and yet Obama's doing virtually the same thing, but yet there's still plenty of death and destruction in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he also said he would close Guantanamo, and that's one reason why many of us voted for him. He gave a perception of being a progressive candidate, and he told us that the slogan was "Change we could believe in." And I for one, am wondering if it was chump change. I really don't see much of a difference, and I think it's more dangerous where because he was a Democrat, because Bush was an easy act to follow, and because he is the first African American president, we've let our guard down and we've put our expectations very low, and we don't hold him accountable like we should. And I think this organization will do what we can to educate the public on this and change that dynamic.
Yeah, I'm thinking of personally myself. I'm thinking about going up there to Washington for a different agenda, but maybe attend part of if I can get in, attend a day or two of the trial while it's going on. And I think that people could get in there if they live in that area. If they're visiting Washington, they could visit and attend the trial. I think is it in Guantanamo or not Guantanamo, but is it in Quantico?
Fort Meade, actually, in Maryland.
Fort Meade. Okay, Fort Meade, Maryland. Okay, thank you.
And I don't know. I don't know if anybody can get close at all, unfortunately.
You might want to contact the Veterans for Peace chapter in that area. They may have some information to help you.
Okay, and thank you very much for the the answers to Bradley Manning and what's going on with the case of our ensuing warfare and how we can go about ending it and maybe creating a world of peace instead of hearing the din of gunfire and drones overhead.
Yeah, thanks for calling. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. We've touched on a lot of interesting points. One thing I would like to bring up is because I've read this fairly recently, the statistics of civilian deaths. In World War I, 20% of the casualties were civilian. Now they're 80%, and they had been rising ever since. Actually, 80% was Vietnam, and it's rising from there. The other interesting thing is this drone business. Not too long ago, I read an article in the paper where they were making a special military medal to give to drone operators that were sitting here in some office somewhere in the United States and creating death and destruction in Iraq and Afghanistan, or in Pakistan for that matter, or anywhere in the world, and it was quietly quashed. Do you have some knowledge of that, Bruce?
Yeah, in fact, there were some that were trying to, and I'm not, please don't take offense to anyone who has carpal tunnel syndrome, but that was one of the things that they were talking about, because so much of their activity, the only particularly injury that they may occur in the drone bases and the drone pilots was that kind of injury. And I think it's kind of interesting because there's just a whole shifting, as I was saying earlier, dynamic of how war is experienced. And, you know, if you ever looked at how drones operate and looked at the drone piloting machine, it's akin to video games. And, in fact, a lot of people have kind of postulated that the whole rise of video games has been, and there is some truth to this, has been supported at some level and even funded by the military, because playing these games is in a sense a training thing for people to be drone pilots. And by the pilots being in this country and piloting drones that are, you know, a lot of them are based in Africa, for instance, they don't really see the effects of it. You know, I'm back at university again, at University of South Florida, and I had a cultural anthropology class. And my professor, she was a cultural anthropologist in Ethiopia, and talked about being in these tribal communities and seeing the drone bases and the drones flying overhead. We don't really see what they do or their effects other than this kind of really blurry video stream. When it hits supposedly a target, quote-unquote, interest, we don't see any of the damage that happens. You know, I always liked the whole notion, and my other brother was in the Air Force, and he always thought it was ridiculous, this whole notion of smart bombs. They're not smart. First of all, they're inanimate objects, but they're dumb bombs, if you want to call them anything, because there's never a case of these bombs being dropped, or even these drones, where there isn't collateral damage, quote unquote. Again, another word that kind of minimizes the cost. So yeah, drones are a scary kind of science that's developed, and you know, certainly other groups are going to use them. They already are. We're using them domestically now to spy on our citizens. Speaking of the whole Snowden and NSA thing. So it's very Orwellian. Very Orwellian. It's very futuristic. It's like all this stuff that you saw in movies like The Terminator, The Rise of the Machines. That was actually one of the movies, I think it was called, one of the Terminator movies was called The Rise of the Machines. And they actually had in that movie, if I remember correctly, little drones in it. You know, so what's the idea? Science fiction becomes reality. It's like when we were kids. We have cell phones now. We grew up watching Star Trek, and the communicators look like cell phones. You know, science becomes reality. But when science has no moral compass to it, Einstein was very strong on this. You know, he had a lot of regrets about his involvement in the creation of the atomic bomb, which was never necessary. Everyone knows this now, that the Japanese were ready to surrender. But this kind of mechanized, kind of maniacal machine kind of stuff, you know. I remember growing up, you know, I sound like I'm talking about the old days, but I'm sure many of our listeners saw that movie, Dr. Strangelove, How I Fell in Love with the Bomb. And the whole insanity of this kind of mechanized war. You know, some have said we're more in danger of a nuclear holocaust now than we ever have been, because there isn't this regulation anymore, or I always had trouble with the word MAD, mutually assured destruction, but now it's kind of like even our own government. I mean, we use depleted uranium in Iraq, which is an element in nuclear weapons. I mean, it's kind of like just Dodge City in the world now, you know, and the biggest purveyor of military weaponry being exported is us, second only, I guess, at this point to China. We're kind of running neck and neck. China, of course, has exported a lot of the best-known machine gun in the world, the AK-47. And, increasingly younger and younger children are looking at war as a way of solving problems.
I'd like to, we've touched on so many things that are interesting and provocative. I'd like to talk about class a little bit. We've talked about how the drones give the participants in war a detachment. We also talked about earlier of how the leaders are so detached from the people they're sent to war. One thing that convinced me to be anti-war was in 1980. I watched the film The Deer Hunter, and I remember the theme of this was a bunch of Russian-American steel workers getting jollied into going into war, and how their own community made them feel it was the right thing to do. It was adventure. It was glory. It was patriotic. It was all these good things to make them feel good about themselves, and when they come back, they would be more accepted in the community. And they were all blue-collar people, working-class people. Even in the absence of the hardware we have, such as the drones, we have an all-volunteer army, and we have people that are having less opportunity for upward mobility than those that are not serving in the military. We have part of this. They don't want a draft again, I think, because right now they've bought off families. If they have someone in the military, the allotment checks are coming to that family and keeping it going. It's also usually the only source of pride these families have is by having a son or a daughter, in this case, in the military. And what's never talked about is how it ruins lives. I think if you look at Bradley Manning and you forget about the whistleblowing, up until very, very recently, the fact that he was gay would absolutely destroy him from the military, give him a dishonorable discharge, and actually ruin his life. There are a lot of very good people that cannot fit into that military mold, and this is something that's very rarely addressed. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. War is very driven by class now. The ruling class does not fight. The ruling class gets the working class and the poor to be the cannon fodder, even in a mechanized kind of situation. And the primary casualties of war, when we're talking about civilians, are the poor and working class. The wealthy elites of these countries that we are bombing often are actually our allies, and we're bombing whatever insurgency we think they may have or whatever. But the wealthy elites are never the casualties of war. And these are economic casualties too, because we now have a situation in our country that's unique in the history of the United States. Some have compared our economic decline to the Great Depression. However, with the Great Depression, you couldn't hide it. In this country, we go to great lengths, or at this time in history in the United States, we go to great lengths to hide the reality of poverty in America. But our own Census Bureau has said that 50% of America now is at or below the poverty line. 50% of America. This is our Census Bureau, which is not some liberal think tank. The reality is that as jobs are shipped more and more with these new things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as more and more jobs, working class jobs, are lost, as even the high-tech industry is being shipped abroad, there are less and less options for working people and poor people in this country. And so the military continues to be a viable option in people's minds to be able to have a leg up and become whatever this supposed American dream that I call the American nightmare is or is supposed to be. And so consequently we have this kind of situation where people are being drafted. And if you look at the recruiting practices that happened, especially with the No Child Left Behind thing that Bush pushed forward. Recruiters are given unfettered access, military recruiters, into our schools, especially inner city schools, and there's been some studies on that. And it's because people, this is, ironically, with the Supreme Court overturning affirmative action and voting rights in the last 24 hours, the only affirmative action left for poor people of color is the military. Now, mind you, it's still going to be hard for you to go up in the ranks in the military. It's still class and race driven as far as any kind of officer class. But it's the one place left where there's, you can be rich, poor, black, white, male, female, and get in the military. And so people are looking at it. I mean, I have dear friends of mine that are looking at it, but their kids are looking at it, and these are people that are struggling, that are barely making it. It's like the only thing that they have out. And yet, even in the military, I dealt with this family not too long ago. He was given an Article 15, which for those who are in the military, that's a disciplinary measure, because he had come back from Iraq and had some mental issues and became suicidal and did some illegal things. And so they Article 15'd him, and he had a wife and 4 kids, and they are literally, as a military vet, they were on food stamps. Now, the logic in that makes no sense to me. See, that there's this myth that if we go in the military, it'll be an economically upwardly mobile kind of thing. That's not the reality. And so, yeah, it's very important.
Let me expound on that a little bit. I understand that people sign contracts with the military that they're held accountable for, and yet the military never is. And if they are sick or injured, or if they're not injured and they're doing their MOS, their military occupational status, they've considered to have broken their contract, and they don't get the benefits that they entered into when they signed the contract. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, and that's a really, really important issue, because people think, oh, well, they're going to give me a deferment. If I go in, they're going to give me money for college. All these kinds of promises. Recruiters are going to promise you the moon. That's their job. They get bonuses. They get moved up in the ranks by the number of recruits that actually they recruit and actually enlist. But the reality is that if for any reason you don't, as you mentioned, meet the requirements of your MOS, you are not going to have not only the benefits you thought you were going to get, but you can face things like demotion and things like that, where you can end up with nothing at the end of your tour or your time in the military. And you may sign up for a particular thing that you think will keep you from any kind of being involved in the theater of action, I guess is what they call it still. You think, well, I'm going to be stationed in Germany or whatever, and I'll be out of harm's way. And none of those are guarantees anymore. They never really were, but there was this mythology created that you do this, you'll get all that, and that's just not the reality. And it's a tragic con game that the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, devised with, I'm sure, huge input from the Pentagon. That 5-cornered, what I call temple of destruction. And this is what people face now when they look at going to the military. In history, the British Empire had things like the East India Company and the Hudson Bay Company and so on, and these had their own private armies. And it was subterfuge in India, for instance, to create these trade agreements and have these armed forces for the East India Company to go in and get concessions and finally take over the entire subcontinent of India. I see a parallel there between what we do. Historically, we had what they call the open door policy, where unlike other empires, we did not want territorial gain, but we wanted to exploit the resources. Can you briefly touch on that? Well, yeah, I think a whole show should be devoted to private militarized forces. Even when we fought our own revolution, we employed, to some extent, although we never paid them, Native Americans as well as average citizens. And the British, of course, employed the Hessians in the Revolutionary War, which were the German mercenaries and other, I think, mid-European and Eastern European people that we employed as private military. That's worthy of a whole show discussing the move towards privatized military. Last I understood, there are still 75 to 80,000 private military contractors in Iraq. Not to mention, there's still military in Iraq guarding the largest embassy in the world in Baghdad, the so-called Green Zone. Increasingly, by mechanizing on one end our military and privatizing it on another, we are taking out citizens' accountability, which there was precious little to begin with. We know what happened in Abu Ghraib, and that's another story. But by taking out citizens' control of the military and turning it into private contractors' hands, it is a heinous thing. At some point it'd be interesting to share my own experience in private military contractors when I was involved in a relief trip to New Orleans during Katrina, about a week after the hurricane and the flooding happened. There were privatized military everywhere, not to mention the 82nd Airborne, and that's another whole discussion too, and maybe for a future show, talking about not only privatized military, but the growing use of military on our own soil. Not just National Guards, and we all remember that from the 60s and early 70s with Kent State and other things like that, but the growing number of private militarized contractors, which, by the way, are also now getting all the same hardware the U.S. military has, including drones. So I don't think it's way too detailed to go into tonight. I mean, there's so many subjects we've discussed, which I think giving a broad overview of things is important. But I'm hoping in future discussions we can get into some more specifics about all these things, because the vastness of the military-industrial complex is astronomical. I mean, I think our military budget is, almost $1 trillion now every year.
I think I would like to pick this up next time we meet and have these conversations. And I urge people to call in if you have any questions or comments that concern the issues we're talking about. And one thing came to mind when Bruce talked about his background. The chief of police of Madison, who was a member of Veterans for Peace, and he was very well liked in that community for many years. Can't think of his name offhand, but he became a priest later. So you have some good company there.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's been a real honor to have you both on the show. And every month we're going to be having a spot for Veterans Voices and Veterans for Peace. And I'm very proud to be in the same organization as you. And we're in St. Pete. We're in Chapter 119, 119. And I just want to say, if you wish to be, Mahatma Gandhi, if you wish to be the change you wish to seek in the world, like Mahatma Gandhi says, join Veterans for Peace. And you can log on to www.vetsforpeace.org. You can find your local chapter, and we hope to hear from you. And be the change you wish to seek in the world, and stay tuned, because once a month we will be broadcasting. Thank you, and have a good night. And once again, I want to thank you, Don McKeating, President of this chapter, and also Reverend Bruce.
Thank you very much for having us, Sue.
Anytime.
Pleasure to be on here.
Pleasure to have you.
And I'm looking forward to next time.
Me too.
Okay.